Everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to this town hall about food insecurity. We have three excellent panelists with us, including my good friend Kate Mayer, Executive Director and CEO at Greater Chicago Food Depository, Jennifer Bucky Lamplow, Chief Impact Officer at Northern Illinois Food Bank, and Rebecca Wolf, Senior Food Policy Analyst at Food and Water Watch. So I just want to say thank you to each of you for joining. The reason why we wanted to have this particular town hall about this topic is that unfortunately, way too many of our fellow neighbors and even the 8th Congressional District are food insecure. So for those of you aware, there are roughly 750,000 people in the 8th Congressional District, as there are in most other congressional districts in the country. Of those people, 14% are thought to be food insecure. Now, what does that mean? That means they either have low food security, they don't have access to enough nutrients and calories to basically sustain themselves in any given day. Or they might have access, but it's intermittent. And sometimes it might be a situation where the parents go without so they can make sure that their children have enough. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that across the country, there are 44 million Americans who are food insecure, including 13 million children. 13 million children, imagine that. Despite federal and state investment into food programs ever since the pandemic, unfortunately, food insecurity has only increased over the last 3 years, which has been kind of a paradoxical situation because it appears on the surface that the economy has bounced back at a macro level since the pandemic. However, food insecurity continues to go up. And that has been an issue that many people have been extremely concerned about. On top of that, there's been great volatility in the grocery market. Because of a wave of consolidations and store closures, I've contended that unfortunately there's been an unusual concentration of power, market power, in the hands of certain food manufacturers as well as grocery chains, such that food prices have gone up by more than 20%. And we all have anecdotes about this, even at the same time that for many of these grocery chains, we've seen their costs either plateau or go down. So really, it's a question of whether there's enough competition and whether they've utilized their market power to gouge customers. Now, I'll just close with one observation, which is food security touches everybody. My own family, when I immigrated to this country, unfortunately, my father lost his income for a time. And fortunately, we were allowed to move into public housing and food stamps. It's now called SNAP. And so I'm a product of food stamps and SNAP benefits, and it allowed us to survive. It allowed us to get off the ground economically. And now I am a proud supporter of those benefits, and I will do everything in my power to fight for them every single day. It's one of those staples that I believe everyone should fight for. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you panelists for being incredible advocates. And I'd like to now recognize each of you for a minute or so to kind of give your introductory remarks. And then we already have a bunch of questions that are teed up. So maybe I'll start with Kate, and then I'll go to Jennifer and then Rebecca. So Kate, could you say a few words?
Sure, and I'm gonna start with a huge thank you. Many folks on the webinar today may or may not know that September is a time of year that all of the anti-hunger organizations recognize as Hunger Action Month. And so to be able to kick off Hunger Action Month with you, Congressman, you have been fierce in your dedication and frankly, I think brave in your willingness to talk about your own family's experience with food insecurity and SNAP. And I am so grateful for that. Everything you said is exactly what we experience in Chicago. And I know my friend Jen in a moment will talk specifically about the 8th district in more detail. But at a high level, what I would say is coming out of the pandemic, we saw this extraordinary surge in need, particularly among families with children. And even within that, there was disparity. Households of color, Black and Latino households, in particular experience food insecurity at much higher rates. And while it feels like we have moved on from the pandemic, we have many, many, many people in our community and across the country who are still struggling with the most basic of needs, the ability to get food for themselves and their families. Certainly, food costs, and I know Rebecca can talk about this, is part of the story, but also part of the story, as you noted, is the safety net. We have had systematic attempts to water down and weaken this safety net. You have been fierce about that. It is, in fact, why we are so concerned that we really need a strong farm bill right now in Congress, because while Jen and I work on the ground in communities every day to make sure that people have food through food pantries, the charitable food system is only part of the response. We need a strong safety net. So thank you, and so grateful to be here today.
Hey, thank you so much, Kate. Jen, can you say a couple words?
Yes, and I echo everything Kate just said, especially the thanks to you, Congressman, for the work that you've done in this arena for us in the food insecurity space. Not only echoing everything Kate said, but I really want to level set for people that even though there are safety net benefits out there, not everybody qualifies, but they're still food insecure. And so if you look at your district and the number of people who are food insecure, about a third of them are still food insecure, but don't qualify for SNAP. And so, those who do, we need them to have it and to use it, but we also need to maybe change that system a little bit so people who need it can qualify. And Kate, as she said, we're on the ground constantly talking about the need for SNAP and what good it does out there for our families and our neighbors. The other thing is around underemployment. Congressman, you said in the beginning, well, at a macro level, the economy is looking so much better. Your unemployment rate in District 8 is only about 3.9%, but a lot of those families are working and they still can't make ends meet. And so we don't talk about underemployment enough when we look at these numbers because we're just looking at unemployment. And if you look at the cost of living versus minimum wage or what, even higher than minimum wage, it costs a lot of money to live in Northern Illinois and our families just can't make it work. And so we need the support for us, the food banks, who can help our neighbors out at food pantries and mobile markets and through our programs and with our kid meals. But we also need, the support of employers to really make sure that they're paying our neighbors a living wage.
Very good. Well, Jen, thank you so much for those remarks. Rebecca, could you say a couple words?
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll just say I'm so looking forward to this conversation today. I've already just really excited to hear everything that my co-panelists have said. And I think, Congressman, you teed it up so nicely, bringing together both talking about food insecurity, but also our concerns with market power and how these companies are really utilizing that. And I know the term price gouging I've already seen in the questions is one that we've been talking about a lot. And so at Food and Water Watch, we focus both on consumer advocacy and environmental advocacy. And I think, being able to talk with you all today about how we see those two things as working hand in hand. There's a real complete vision in something like a fair farm bill that both supports our families, supports food security, and also is a good bill for farmers who are working to put food on the table. So I'm really excited to have that full rounded conversation and what we can do within our communities and within Congress and the administration today. So thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. So we have a bunch of questions already. Maybe I'll start with this question to Kate. What can we do as individuals to help alleviate the food insecurity in our community? We know what it is to be poor and hungry from our country of origin, Nigeria. What can we do here?
That is a great question. And I think the great news is there are amazing organizations all across the 8th Congressional District, all across Northern Illinois, all across the great state of Illinois and the country, who are every day on the front line. So just for context, Northern Illinois Food Bank and the Greater Chicago Food Depository, we are both part of Feeding America, which is a national network, 200 food banks serving every county in the United States. And all of our food banks need volunteers. All of our community-based food programs. In the case of the Greater Chicago Food Depository, we work in Cook County. We have 800 food pantries and soup kitchens that we partner with. They all need volunteers. So I would encourage anyone here on the webinar today, take action. You can roll up your sleeves and be a part of the weekly, the monthly, the daily response to hunger in your community, both Northern Illinois Food Bank and Greater Chicago Food Depository. If you go to our websites, you can find there's an easy button to click to volunteer. I would also say that all of us need resources. So whether that is donating food to the food drive or donating dollars, every dollar, every can of food, every hour of time matters. And then finally, I would say lifting your voice. I think it is surprising sometimes, particularly we think about the 8th Congressional District, people hear the word suburbs and they have a view in their mind. They believe that everybody is wealthy. And I think we need to cast a light on the fact that there are people who are struggling, but there are policy solutions, and we need to lift our voice and make it possible for our leaders in Congress to do the right thing.
Maybe, thank you, Kate. Jen, maybe I could just piggyback on that a little bit. Like, what are you seeing in terms of our donations going down since the pandemic, when it was very clear that our neighbors needed more help and there was a lot of awareness of the need? Have monetary donations gone down since the pandemic? Have food donations gone down? And has the need increased or stayed the same since the pandemic, or gone down, but not by as much as we thought?
Yes, yes, thank you. All of that. The need has gone up tremendously. So pre-pandemic, since pre-pandemic, we're serving about 40% more neighbors every month. And so in District 8 alone, you said there's about 750,000 people in District 8. Of the counties that we serve in Northern Illinois Food Bank, which is 4, Lake, DuPage, Kane, and McHenry, about 55,000 people are food insecure, 16,000 of them are children. And so that's 40% more than pre-pandemic. And so to Kate's point, all of our food pantries and our shelters and our soup kitchens and our programs, are working tirelessly to meet that need. But as everybody knows, it's more and more expensive every day. Food is more and more expensive, coupled with donations going down. Especially our donors who were maybe donating at a level like around $100 or more, because people don't have extra income right now because everything is so expensive, and people are struggling to make ends meet. And so the high demand, the high need, coupled with the fewer resources, is making it really, really hard for all of our partners to meet the need. And so we're seeing all of that happening. And again, to Kate's point about the suburbs and rural areas, people don't often equate food insecurity with those areas, but the need is high all around. And, educating yourself and others about even what's out there, right? Encouraging people to see if they do qualify for SNAP, because they might not, but there are a lot of people who do qualify who don't take advantage of the program. And so really getting the word out there, like start with, do I qualify for SNAP? And then, there's all of these amazing programs and community partners out there who can help.
Thank you, Jen. Rebecca, I guess talk to us a little bit about food costs. Like, for someone, I mean, obviously, most of us go to the supermarket and we notice that things are just a lot more expensive now than they were before the pandemic. But can you put this in a little bit of perspective and kind of what's going on with food costs? And I got to believe that's also tipping people into being potentially food insecure and maybe not eligible for SNAP, but they just can't buy as much.
Right. Yeah, what we're seeing, and Food and Water Watch has done research on really following the trend of food prices to understand both food prices and the relationship with consolidation, which again, you started with, is a real big concern for us, and I think is a growing understanding and concern for people across the country. They're kind of seeing and feeling and understanding consolidation in terms of how it impacts them every day. So we're hearing that a lot from our folks. The way that, so even as inflation has slowed, we're still seeing those kind of record high, both prices for consumers, but also profits for these big grocery retailers. So it's been true that 1 in every 3 grocery dollars goes to Walmart. And that's just to kind of give you a sense that it's a lot of our food dollars are going to one big company that in often a consolidated market, you'll see them setting prices, kind of controlling the market and keeping prices high. We've seen companies talking about keeping prices high even after the pandemic, and even after, or as the pandemic is slowing, even as those supply chain frustrations, breakdowns happened in the early pandemic. So we're seeing those prices remain high, and it's really impacting American families. So we've been really grateful and thankful to Congress members who are really paying close attention to this, like yourself, and also the Biden administration really taking this seriously with updates to merger guidelines and really antitrust enforcement when it comes to some of these really big companies. We have the Kroger-Albertsons merger court case happening right now. So I think there's some news in that prices are tough right now, but we're seeing real unprecedented action that is giving us hope on those prices.
Yeah, the Kroger-Albertsons merger is one that the FTC has sued to block, and it affects us in our area because it affects the Jewel Osco and Mariano's brands, which are well known in this area. So we're watching this merger very closely. Kate, I have another question here from our audience. This this is maybe a little bit directed to me, but maybe you can kind of give us the state of legislation on this as well, which is at our own food pantry. It's called Faith Feeds in Palatine. We saw a large increase in numbers when the pandemic extension of SNAP benefits ended. So more people came to their pantry when they couldn't take advantage of SNAP benefits. I guess, let me just ask you this. What is your assessment of the state of play and in terms of SNAP benefits and the food bill, the farm bill, I should say? I always think of it as the food bill because it's all about food, whether it's grown or distributed, but it's the farm bill, and SNAP comes out of the farm bill. How do you assess the farm bill? Do you think any of these types of benefits that ended might be reinstated, or what are you hoping for at this point?
So let me just take a moment to level set because everyone may not know. I really appreciate that question about the emergency allotments. And so let me just explain. In those early days of April and May of 2020, when all of a sudden we saw across this country millions of people having to turn to the emergency food system, many of them for the very first time, Congress swiftly took action. And among the things that they did, there was a child tax credit, but then there was also what was known as these emergency allotments. So in effect, the SNAP amount that people could get, and if folks don't know, the way SNAP works, you get an EBT card, so it's like a credit card, and every month it gets loaded up with dollars that you can use to shop at a grocery store for food. You can only use those SNAP benefits for food. You can't use SNAP benefits for diapers. You can't use those benefits for soap or laundry detergent, which also is a challenge for people. So Congress gave people who were really struggling a little bit more money each month, but then that went away. And when that went away, and this is what the question is referring to, within days, and I can remember, I actually had a conversation with Jen. Within days, we saw food pantries all across Illinois, all across this country, immediately seeing more people lining up for food. The impact was that swift. And there has been no additional extension of that. So that is part of why we are continuing to see record numbers of people. You heard Jen reference this. I'll say at the Greater Chicago Food Depository, our numbers, which what we measure when we say our numbers, the number of people turning to food pantries in our community, we are back at the level that we were during that summer of 2020, which was the high water mark. We had a month, April of this past year, we actually served more people across our network of food pantries and soup kitchens than we have ever served in our 46-year history. So high watermark. Now, the question is, what do we do about it? And that's really where the Farm Bill becomes so critical. The Farm Bill is the legislative tool that provides funding for a couple of critical programs, including SNAP. So for the folks on the webinar who are not aware, there is a proposal that has come forward from the House Republicans. It is scary to me because that proposal has actually proposed cutting SNAP further rather than restoring the cuts that were that happened earlier. And so we are really, really worried. I believe the current proposal is to cut SNAP by $30 billion over 10 years, which from my perspective, when we have record numbers of people still turning to food pantries and soup kitchens, we have record numbers of children showing up in need of food every day. Now is not the time to cut the program further. Now is actually the time to make sure that that program is there and works for all of our neighbors in their most vulnerable moment.
Thank you, Kate. Jen, let me just go back to something you said earlier, because I still think I maybe just to put a fine point on it, what Kate said is that it appears that the number of people who are visiting are the same number of people as during the pandemic. How do people explain that? How do you explain it? Is it because of the food costs that are out there that are so high that people need to turn to the food pantry? Is that what's going on, or is there something else that we're missing here? And you know, is it underemployment having gone up? Because that's also anyway. Why don't you kind of tell us what's really going on here?
Yes, for sure. And to back up Kate's point about the number, we track every month the number of visits to our network. And that cliff when the SNAP benefits went away that March, and we saw that number go up overnight to the tune of over 100,000 extra visits that month. It happened quick. It went from here to here really fast. And I think that it was the sort of perfect storm of people didn't have time to recover from the pandemic. The benefits went away. And then this sort of like inflationary time hit where prices went up dramatically. And so there was no recovery time. And instead of a sort of a gradual, down, if we were going to cut that pandemic benefit, instead of a sort of a gradual offboarding of that, it was a cliff and people fell and they didn't get a chance to recover. And so all of that coupled with everything we've talked about, underemployment, the cost of everything, not just food, the cost of housing, the cost of everything. We call them social determinants of health, right? All of these things, housing, transportation, food, they all cost so much more. And when you didn't have a chance to recover in the first place, and then you lost that safety net, these numbers are just going to keep growing. To Kate's point, we've seen these record numbers. It's more than at the height of the pandemic. We're seeing about 570,000 visits a month just in Northern Illinois. That's not even Kate's numbers. That's not even Cook County. We serve the 13 counties surrounding Cook. It's hard to even kind of wrap your brain around how
A lot of them are
astronomically
working.
high.
a lot of them are working. They just
Yes.
can't afford the
Yeah.
cost of groceries.
Yeah.
And so they come to you.
Yeah.
I guess, Rebecca, I think like this is a little bit eye-opening for me to hear our friends in the food pantry world talk about how the number of visits is at an all-time high, or at least as high as during the pandemic. Um, where do you see kind of the situation going from here with regard to food costs? How do you folks analyze that? How do you, like, I know we talk about these mergers and consolidations and trying to make sure that there isn't too much of concentration of power, market power, but are there other things that you're seeing on the horizon that we either need to allow or do something about to change the situation, you know, significantly?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I too am learning a lot in terms of really where folks are feeling this impact. And I'm really struck with how Kate talked about, especially the Farm Bill and what's important coming up. And I think we were chatting about this before we got on, but I think one of the really big misconceptions with the Farm Bill or the Food Bill, I like that. I like the way that you called it that, is that there's this false divide on fair food policy and fair farm policy. And what I'm hearing with all of these costs too is something that when I work with farmers and farmers in the Midwest, farmers in your state, is that they're feeling this impact as well. And they're feeling this squeeze, this pressure to get big or get out. And we can really institute policies that support both consumers and farmers for a fair price on either side. And I think you were spot on in pointing out just some of that market control that we need to continue to look at and take on. I mentioned the Kroger Albertsons merger, and that has an impact for your folks. I think the Federal Trade Commission has done a really incredible job on rewriting the merger guidelines to really closely look at not only consumer prices, but lack of competition and how that in fact affects consumers, but then also the labor market. So being able to get a fair union job within the grocery sector, also how it impacts the prices that farmers get on the production side. So I think there's a real, again, a real tide that's turning there, and we're following that closely because I think it's incredibly important. But as we go
Jump
on,
in for a second.
go ahead.
Like I what's really interesting, or I mean, it strikes me, and tell me if I'm wrong about this. We don't have a food shortage. Like our farmers are creating enough food to feed America. There's something wrong in the pipeline between where the food is being created and when it gets to people's homes. And that's where I'm concerned about that market power potentially, um, disrupting an otherwise functioning market.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on. I think, real promise again in the updated merger guidelines, but also just taking a look at our antitrust laws and being able to bolster and give more authority to the FTC to take on some of that market power. Really big. It's just been a really big tide change, I think, in terms of the policy paying really close attention to this and taking it really seriously. So again, I think, just your example of taking this on is a really big change that I have folks that have worked in this field since the 70s, and they said this, this moment is unprecedented in taking that really, really seriously. So I think I'm hopeful that those food prices will reflect that soon.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, Kate, I then want to start to go to a lightning round here because I have so many questions all of a sudden. I might ask a couple at a time, okay? One is, can you talk about the issue of fraud within SNAP? Have we seen an incidence of fraud within SNAP, like what happened with PPP loans during COVID? And then what's the status of getting free school lunches across the board here in Illinois, like they do apparently, we know about Minnesota, but also Michigan. Can you talk about those two issues, the fraud and the free school lunches across the board for all children?
I can. I also, if I can just build on
Yeah.
one point from Rebecca and just about SNAP again. There is sometimes this dialogue about how um, the farmers versus the hungry people. And the thing about SNAP that I think it's important for people to remember is it is not just good for people who face hunger. It's actually really good for our farmers as well. Every dollar that is allocated to the SNAP program is a dollar that gets spent in a grocery store. That grocery store, in turn, is able to hire people. Often it's people in the neighborhood where the grocery store is. That dollar goes all the way back to the farmer and grower. I also want to just note, you made this point around it's not a supply chain challenge. It's not that we don't grow enough food. We grow enough food, not just for this district, not just for the state or this country. We grow enough food for the world. The reason people are hungry in the 8th district, in Illinois, and in this country is because they're living in poverty. They don't have enough dollars to go to the grocery store to buy the food that they need. And so we have to ask ourselves why. I want to quickly pivot this question about fraud. I'm so grateful somebody asked it because it gave me an opportunity to debunk a couple of myths. And one of those is actually, of all of the government programs, SNAP has the least amount of fraud. And it is actually something that I think we should be proud of. SNAP is a program that has been proven again and again to be effective. Not only does it provide critical support and lift households, including children, out of poverty, it has a very low error rate. And in fact, of the errors that happen, many of those are errors of underpayment. In other words, you're supposed to get $100 and you only get $75. So fraud is actually, it is well documented that SNAP does not have a lot of fraud. It is overseen. There is a lot of rigor in the program. There is a lot of paperwork. And in fact, that's one of the things that we worry about. We make it so hard for people to get benefits that we know that there are many people in the state of Illinois, particularly older adults, who are eligible for SNAP, but who don't go through the process of getting the application because we've made it hard. So I'll leave that there. On to this question around school lunches. So it's a really interesting question about when and if Illinois will go to a model that California and Minnesota have adopted. There has been conversation around that. I have the privilege of serving on the Illinois Commission to End Hunger, and it's something that has been raised. I would lift up one of the reasons that we haven't advocated is because today in Illinois, the way that school breakfast and lunch is being administered, the households most at risk are already getting that program. So when states like Minnesota go to a universal model, really what's happening is that families and households that are at the higher end of the income ladder are now getting a meal. And you can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Ultimately, it reduces stigma, which is super important. But in a world where we have constrained resources, I think from the anti-hunger community, we want to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable are getting resources that connect them to food and other supports that they need. And that is happening today in Illinois through the way that our school breakfast and lunch programs are administered.
Thank you, Kate. Jen, elderly folks who are food insecure struggle to access food pantries. They might not drive, or as you know, we occasionally have inclement weather in the Chicago area. So even if they do drive, they may be deterred from doing so. What are other options for them? And then secondly, another question is, how do you view the issue of fresh food versus processed food? And how do you try to make sure that everyone, especially children, have access to the more fresh options if possible? And is it more expensive?
Thank you. Yes, I'll talk to both of those around the sort of the access issue for older adults, or really there's access issues kind of across the board for many people. We know transportation can be challenging, especially in the suburbs. And so, we are always, and I know Greater Chicago Food Depository and Northern Illinois Food Bank are both always looking at ways to increase access for our neighbors seeking food assistance. And so we do things like provide home delivery in certain areas, especially for those like, older adults or people who just have a lack of access to transportation. We have online food pantries, so people can order and either go pick up or have someone pick up for them, or can get a home delivery. And we have people who will help place those orders if perhaps someone struggles with technology. So we really try and work within our network to increase access where there's barriers like transportation. And so it's a constant process of trying to make that better and to make the access to the food as easy as possible for our neighbors who are seeking it. Around the fresh food, I think there's this sort of misperception sometimes about food pantries, and they're thinking of like a closet in a church basement that has cans in it, and so many, and some of our pantries are like that, and that's great too. But so many of our agencies, they look like grocery stores. They're filled with fresh produce and frozen meat and dairy and whole grains. And if you look at the food that we distribute, the top 3 things we distribute are produce, protein, and dairy. And they're if you look at the plate, right? If you think of your plate, the My Plate model from USDA, that's what we see in the majority of our food pantries, and we make a concerted effort
By the
to
way, when
source
someone
those
comes
foods.
to your, so let's say a family comes to you for food, are they given a certain allotment that they are allowed to take at any given visit? Is that how it normally works?
It depends on the food pantry, but the majority of our food pantries are what we call choice pantries. So it's just like shopping in a grocery store. You walk in, and you can pick. Sometimes there's limits, especially right now because the need is so high, and it's getting harder and harder to source food with our resources. So some of the pantries may limit some items, but you still can choose. So you can go in. You're not just handed a box or a bag of food.
Got it. Rebecca, do we know how much food price increases are due to farmers' costs, in addition to obviously the consolidation issue and market power? And then also, is there any kind of thing in terms of is the web making it easier for people to maybe access food options at a lower cost, maybe at a distance that they can kind of almost mail order in? It's a new form of competition to their local supermarket or something like that.
Yeah, those are both great questions. And, as we've been talking through this discussion, I've been thinking just about the ways in which consolidation impacts us all. So to your first point, inflation, the inflationary forces of higher costs for farmers are absolutely impacting farmers, but by and large, it's really impacting their bottom line. So oftentimes when I talk about the food system, and because we have a few of these big companies that are really dictating prices, and often in cases is like an hourglass. So we have a lot of farmers at the top and a lot of consumers at the bottom, but we have a bottleneck of companies that are really dictating prices for folks. So inflation is absolutely impacting farmers, but we're still seeing record profits from a lot of grocery retailers that, again, I've seen the Biden administration take on very seriously, and we're having all of these conversations. So it's a really good sign. I wanted to point to, in this conversation with consolidation and thinking about options, I think oftentimes we don't talk about how it necessarily impacts the food safety. And I think there are many different sides to this. We need to kind of take on this issue, but One of your policies that looks at FDA regulation of baby food, I think, is a really good example that when we have these supply chains or we have these few companies that are kind of controlling that bottleneck in the middle, we have these opportunities for really big food safety problems. And being able to take a close look at that and better regulate some of these supply chains and make them safe for families is also a really important part of the conversation. And it's kind of that corollary to food prices. We're all thinking about the safety of our food and being able to afford it and put it on the table. So it's two sides of that kind of market power coin that I think is really important to take on as well.
Right. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I actually got a question directed to me. You know, he said the question was during my time about my time on food stamps, my family's time on food stamps, how does that affect my view of the program? I think the way it affects me is that I look at folks and I just say there, but for the grace of God go I. I think that you know, every family at some point has a disruption, and some families can absorb it and not necessarily have to you know, do what other families do, including mine, which is necessarily take advantage of government benefits, but a lot can't, and they have to do that. And so maybe one way I look at it is, you know, it's really nobody wants to be like on these programs. Nobody like that's not something, that's not an aspiration of people. And I think there's a little bit of a misconception that somehow people want to be on food stamps. They want to take advantage of SNAP. They want to go to Northern Illinois Food Bank and receive you know, food gratis. That's just not my experience. That's not when I meet a mother or father, that's not something that they want to do, but sometimes they don't have a choice, and we have to make it possible for them to be able to feed their families. So that's how it's influenced me, and that's why I'm so protective of these programs, which are, you know, life sustaining in their nature. So that's how I view it. Well, folks, I'm being given the hook. And so maybe I'll allow each of you to spend a couple seconds with your closing thoughts, and then I'll end it myself. So Kate, can you start us off on this?
I want to start by saying what you just said was one of the most beautiful things ever. Instead of wagging our finger when people sign up for a program, I wish we could remember that it's actually the bravest, most courageous thing for somebody to say that they need assistance. And for a mother or a father to come forward and say, I need to make sure that my children has food is an extraordinary act. And I'm grateful for your willingness to talk about it. I'm also just so grateful for your leadership. For everyone on this webinar, you may or may not know every single letter that we have asked members of Congress to sign on, every single moment that we in the anti-hunger community have asked Congressman Krishnamoorthi to stand with us, he has said yes. You have been a fierce advocate for people facing hunger, and I am so grateful for your leadership and for this opportunity to talk with everybody today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Jen?
And again, I'll echo everything Kate just said. And I did notice in the questions that some folks were asking about access to food and how they find our food resources. Anywhere in the country, you can go to Feeding America's website and find your local food bank. Greater Chicago Food Depository and Northern Illinois Food Bank both have great websites with great resources. So chicagosfoodbank.org or solvehungertoday.org. We have a food finder map out there. And so that food finder map, you can just put in your zip code and it'll tell you all the programs and food pantries near you. If you don't need it, you might know somebody who does. So please spread the word. And remember that to Congressman, to your point, like people aren't seeking out like, oh, I want to go get on these programs, and a lot of them are working. The majority of them are working. They're just not making enough to make ends meet. And so, support those programs and let people know that they're out there.
Thank you very much, Jen. Rebecca?
Thank you so much. This has just been wonderful, and I echo both Kate and Jen on their remarks with you, Congressman, and your leadership. I think I'm on more of the production side of things, and just to give folks a sense, the Congressman has signed on to the Farm System Reform Act, is leading on, like I said, that bill around food safety within the FDA. And these are really key pieces to this full puzzle of how we get at food prices and food access. So again, just want to echo their thanks, and it's been great to speak with you all today.
Well, I can't say enough good things about Kate and Jen and Rebecca and everything that they do every day to help our families and our country kind of cope with this issue. Frankly, a lot of times I'm surprised in Washington there's as much debate as there is about food policy, but I think that people have suspicions about families that might take advantage of these food programs or these benefits to feed their families. And I think that I'm going to continue to do everything I can to educate people who might not be knowledgeable about the types of families that take advantage. I'm going to continue to fight for keeping these programs in place. And I'll do everything I can to continue supporting the three of you and others as you do the same. And I can't thank everyone enough for joining this Lunch and Learn webinar. And I look forward to talking to everybody again soon. And thank you again for tuning in.